technology, and now let's talk automation.
Happy third Thursday, everyone. I'm not sure what happened with our music there. It sounded like we had a double track for a second. But thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We've got another great episode lined up with Claire and James, and of course, Karen and I, as always. So today we're going to be talking about how to kind of rescue an automation program if it's gone wrong, maybe things to avoid in the first place, and signs to keep an eye out for if maybe you're starting to head in the wrong direction. So as is tradition, now that I'm back in the driver's seat, Karen threw out the icebreaker questions last time, but I'm bringing them back as our opportunity for everybody to join us in the comments. Tell us where you're joining from. Let us know what your icebreaker answer is as well. But James, I'm going to come to you first. I'm going to ask you to give your quick introduction to let everybody know who you are and what you do in the world of digital transformation. And then our icebreaker question today is going to be, tell us, 60 seconds about a time that maybe you've seen an automation program fall off of the tracks. So I'm going to come to you first here. And again, everybody in the comments, let us know where you're joining from.
Thanks, Emma. Hey, everyone. Great to meet you all. My name's James Swinford. I'm the CEO of Virtual Operations. So I started Virtual Operations probably about 9 years ago. I've got a rich background in automation across the industry. As for the icebreaker question, Emma, a 60-second overview. I might need a bit longer, but I'll try and limit it to 60 seconds, right? But I think for me, one that really springs to mind is a more recent one that we've dealt with, where we're involved with a client in the entertainment sector. With this client specifically, we had previously engaged with them a few years prior on what we call a POC or pilot program as they begin to build out their tactical automation journey using an RPA product. With that, we built some really positive momentum on the account. We gained some really key stakeholder buy-in early on. And because of that, they then moved on to kind of a second stage of work with us. And that was really the idea of a successful start to a program. However, when we started to accelerate this, we started to face some really familiar issues. The business wanted a solution that involved multiple IA tools, including conversational AI, document ingestion. And when we started to try and scale this from a tactical business into a more of a accelerated program, we realized the environment wasn't ready. The COE wasn't set up correctly, and they really weren't in a position to handle the scale of the deployment. So one of the key failings here, and one of the things that we saw, is the success of a tactical deployment led to a belief that the organization was ready to accelerate, whereas in the real world, the lack of stakeholder engagement across the program meant that we should have looked to reduce scope, which we're now trying to do, and we should have focused much more on enablement, which I think is something that's often forgotten about when we're looking at tools and technology in intelligent automation.
Wonderful. And I had to remember to unmute myself, as is our joke running here. Kieran, you haven't caught me yet. Claire, I want to come to you with the icebreaker question and that opportunity to do your introduction as well. So who are you, and maybe what have you seen go wrong in the past as well?
Sure. Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire. I work for the same organisation as James in a head of advisory and process excellence role. Have done for a few years now, getting on for 5 years with Virtual Operations. And then prior to that, I was in a process excellence consultant role, delivering primarily Lean and Six Sigma transformation before I moved into the automation industry. So yeah, I've certainly seen my fair share of large scale initiatives fail and need a bit of first aid. I have another example that's a bit less gradual. A few years ago, we were working with one of our longest served clients, and we were kicking off a transformation program in their customer service organisation. Our rather abrupt introduction to the team was when we had the invite to an international workshop of 50 plus people who in their minds were at the end of their discovery phase, and they just wanted us to show up and confirm that they'd found the right opportunities. So after their internal process leads had finished I have to say, very polished looking presentation and asked for our feedback in front of all of those people, we had a bit of an awkward moment because we had to deliver the message that they'd been looking in all the wrong places. And what they'd done is they'd focused on very simple downstream activities, mainly looking at things like exception management in their sales orders, which could have been much better addressed if they tackled the root cause and looked upstream a bit. They'd only map their opportunities to single processes in isolation. And then they'd assigned these very arbitrary weightings to try to score and rank those opportunities without actually factoring in any quantifiable business case whatsoever. They'd use quite a crude high, medium, low scoring for the benefits and the process complexity and so on. And in doing that, they'd whittled down a list of several hundred processes to about 10. And they put in so much effort to get to that stage, but we hadn't been involved. So we'd had no input whatsoever to the approach. And basically they wanted us to give them a sense check and validate that they'd done the right thing, but they hadn't. And once we'd roughly calculated they'd only achieve 20% of their overall savings target, that's what we had to tell them. Happily, in this case, we were able to work together to get the programme back on track, but it was a pretty difficult message to deliver, and it did cost the client quite a lot of time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've got to say, having to have the conversation of you're only at 20% of what you were anticipating your savings would probably not be the best message to have to deliver. I am going to, before we come to you, Kieran, to do your icebreaker question, I do want to touch on, we've got some folks from Texas, along with Virginia and California. And then I saw we've got Guatemala. And then I thought I saw, here we go. Some UK folks also joining with you guys today. So then Kieran, I'm going to come to you for your quick introduction and maybe that story as well to get us started. And then we'll dive into some of the other questions that we have for the crew today.
Okay, Emma, in 60 seconds or less. Look, Kieran, for those who don't know me, I've been doing digital transformation, technology, and business change for 25 years in automation and data robotics and AI and all sorts of operational roles. We all love to be heroes. I described that fact, smiled blindingly, confidently, and then realized very often we're not. My thing that I seen where things went really bad was actually mine. It was the very first time I did a POC or POV with robotics. I thought I'd set it up correctly, hired a consultant, ended up they were training their staff on the job, found lots of processes, ended up they were offshoring the process, changing it, found an SME who was meant to work with the process and do it wonderfully well, suddenly became unavailable, wrong time of year, wrong time, whatever. So I made a complete mess up to a point of that POC. The one thing I do say, and this is something that organizations say, and EY, I think, came out with stats years ago, saying 50% of automations fail. I think the other 50% are probably liars at times. Lots of things go wrong. The key bit is, though, recognize all of the great practices and standards that you need, right process, right team, right executive support, whatever else. Get back in the saddle, make sure you reflect and learn on your mistakes and away you go. Thankfully, I did. We fixed the POC. By goodness, it was the most learning that I've ever had. But I continue to learn every day, and that's something for the audience. If it does go wrong, you can rescue it. And today, we're going to talk a little bit more detail about just how.
Great. And then I think I may have spurred some other folks to tell us where they are coming from, because we also see Germany and India as well coming in. And I do want to, because I have such a near and dear spot in my heart for change management, also talk a little bit about my one example before I jump over to James for our first full question. And that is, I think I am so passionate about change management because I've seen how it can completely derail an automation project. And in the past, I've had a client who spent a decent amount of money and ended up having to abandon a project because they couldn't get the buy-in and the excitement behind the change at an enterprise level that was needed to influence the change across the board. And that was my first kind of smack in the face of how much change management can influence a program, and realize that, oh my gosh, we lost our executive sponsor because they couldn't encourage other people to adopt this change, even though it's going to offer a huge return on investment for them. And so that's my little plug back to the people side of things today before we fully dive in. So as I have teased now a couple of times, James, I'm going to come to you for our first question. And I really want to focus on maybe some of those signs and signals that organizations should be keeping an eye out for if they are concerned that maybe they're not trending in the right direction.
Thanks, Emma. I think for us, or in our experience, the first signs usually when they give us a ring in a state of panic. I think it used to be a case in the industry where certainly we saw at the beginnings, our clients would sort of respond to us by issuing RFPs and would be competing for work for kind of new grand programs where automation was new and they were trying to scale it. And they were looking for that partner. I think what we kind of now see a little bit more, it's now a case of kind of jumping into really quick jobs, trying to put their missold licenses to use. And that kind of for us is a large part of the work we're doing now, whereby we're trying to manage expectations about how to actually save a program and how to get it back on track. But in doing that, when we look at the kind of signs for it, the key for us first is to really fully understand what's triggered that call for help. And secondly, how has it been identified? It might, for us and for a few people on the call, it might be a case of sort of stating the obvious, but no organization are going to be able to spot the signs that a digital transformation program might be going wrong unless they've actually got people looking for it. There are undoubtedly, Kieran just mentioned it there, numerous programs out there that are failing currently, but they've just not been flagged yet, right? So they just don't know what they don't know. I think what we've seen, and when we've engaged organizations, it's really important to have someone with that kind of top-down view. So whilst everyone wants to deliver automations, everyone wants to get value, you need to be able to have someone to take a step back and reflect on kind of how different parts of the program are working and whether they're aligning with the organization's goals. And that's certainly when we've been brought in, that's certainly been one of the key things for us to kind of identify early. Who is that person and how are they identifying the actual root cause? The next sort of sign I'd look at is kind of ownership. And we emphasize this a lot through our methodologies that we deliver. There's so many moving parts to a transformation program, and every single part of those need to be fully aligned. If they're not, then it will fail. The clearest indication of a problem is when there is no one clear owner of a digital program to sort of drive it forward. I think it's also crucial, and we've seen this, to do the right things when a problem is identified, and to act as quickly as possible. This is often indicative of a failure or an issue in a program where you haven't identified the problem and you haven't acted quickly enough to fix it. We often look at that, and that might be addressed from the COE perspective, but it's certainly a sign that that's probably not working correctly. Asking relevant questions along the way. I mean, how often have we seen programs where no one's actually taken a moment to stop and ask why? Is there a clear plan? Why have we bought this technology? Are we looking at the solution first instead of the technology first? Can you articulate clearly why you're doing something and what is it going to cost you in the long term? I think what we've said as well, and we try and reiterate this message, is once you've identified there's a problem, the next thing to do is get to the root cause. It's not always going to be straightforward. And sometimes it might take a little time to figure it out, and that might be something you don't necessarily have a lot of, but it's certainly integral to the problem. If we link back to kind of the problem I identified with our client earlier, if it's identified that a scope of a project is too large, or it's poorly defined, I think action needs to be taken very quickly to address that. You can't just kind of blinker up and go ahead. You have to actually look at what the causes are and try to resolve them. The kind of the next one I'd look at, and we've talked about a few times, is cultural issues. I think in an organization, especially at different stages of the automation life cycle, a reluctance to change. That's something that really can put a stop on a digital program and kind of stop it from getting going. I think we look at it and we say, yes, we can expect some of that, but if that sentiment keeps coming and it's something that is not broken down correctly, then that's definitely a sign that either an education cycle has been missed or the organization isn't fully engaged, and you're going to face issues further down the line. The fear for us and what we look at is kind of people are really hesitant, I think, to start again. They're down a path. They've burnt some bridges and they're struggling to go back. I think if I look at from sort of discovery through to delivery, repetition of failed practice often shows us a program that either hasn't got the right leadership in place or has gone down a path that it just can't get back from. And that's typically where we become engaged to go in and help them get back on to the right path.
All right, took me a little longer to get unmuted that time. So I do want to put up a couple of comments that were coming through, and this is a big wall of text on the screen. And Arpin, we're gonna have to get you so that you show up on the live stream with your name, but that idea of ownership of the program being pretty critical seems to be something that is coming and resonating with a lot of the folks that are joining us today. So I did just want to put that out there. And if you're not already looking at the comments and joining in the conversation, please make sure that you do. So then, Claire, I want to come to you with this next question. And it's going to kind of nicely piggyback off of some of what James talked about. And I think he already kind of touched on some of the things that maybe we should be doing to avoid pitfalls or how to recognize them. But I want to dive more specifically into this idea of what are things we should be doing and preparing for on the front end of an automation program so that we avoid any challenges or as many of the challenges as we can avoid heading into an implementation.
Yeah, sure thing. And I will definitely be expanding on some of the points that James made there. To really understand how to avoid the pitfalls, you need to understand the nature of the pitfalls themselves, I think. And on that front, I'd like to start with one of the really common ones, which is insufficient experience within the team, or to be more accurate, not taking the opportunity to combine the subject matter expertise that the business has with the right methodology and the approach that the more experienced automation experts bring to the table. So in the example I shared earlier, we had a client team that were absolutely raring to go, but took a completely inward-looking view of their own processes without an experienced discovery team to guide them. So the team's focused, they're keen to improve. We get that, we want to encourage that. It's certainly preferable all day long to working with an organisation that's reluctant because they're having that change imposed upon them. But it's not always easy to scope the opportunities to the right size or prioritise them correctly. Or take what we would see as a genuinely transformational view when you're used to seeing those processes in their current silos. You might not be familiar with the technological constraints and so on. And then very much linked to that, we see a lot of impatience. By that, I mean rushing in without the important elements in place. It's a very, very common mistake. Too many times we see clients trying to dive headlong into a transformation initiative without an automation strategy in place, without a business case, without a plan that's been properly thought through, without the right infrastructure in place. And usually that's looking at elements like the data center, hardware, VMware, network security. And then especially where the business intends to deploy its own capability, you need team members that truly understand IPA, not just RPA bootcamp graduates. And I'll take a second to apologise to any recent bootcamp graduates who might be listening, but you really do need that more experienced resource involved too. And we've seen companies attempt to spin up their own COEs, try to initiate their first programs with people who maybe have a year or two of automation experience at best, and then they call us in to help. They'll often start off without the methodology, the tools, the templates, the practitioner guidance. Another one we tend to see is lack of good governance procedures, even a lack of fundamental buy-in across all levels of the business. And it sounds really obvious, but it's not enough to start out driven purely by enthusiasm because you just can't wait to get started. You want to see those benefits and then hope to build these things from scratch as you go. They've got to be in place at the absolute start of the journey. And then the next one I wanted to mention is probably the single biggest failure mode we see. And we've already touched on this. Emma, you had a few very resonant comments here. Insufficient executive sponsorship. Without that ongoing commitment from your key executives, the program will fail. There's no doubt about it. And it's that sponsorship that ensures the commitment to all levels of the organisation. And lack of commitment is without doubt the most frequent roadblock we see. Mostly we get told it's lack of time. And I will bet that most of the people listening have come up against that at some point. So why don't the people we need to engage have the time to spend that time and effort on us, with us? Well, it's because the automation program is usually seen as lower priority. Why is it lower priority? We're back to sponsorship again. Often we'll see the project and consultant fatigue, and we end up spending a lot of our time selling and persuading. Sometimes it's a political issue, and it's very hard, in fact, it's impossible to resolve those situations without that sponsorship in place. And the list goes on. Not tracking or reporting benefits might sound daft, but we've seen a lot of very large, initially successful programs lose that sponsorship, that engagement, that momentum, because people weren't made accountable at the right time for ensuring benefits were realised and reported. Then we have misguided expectations. And I say misguided because we have this industry story that RPA at scale will lead to transformation, and that's invariably wrong. It can, but it's not a given. And that message tends to do more harm than good. So we have to make sure that we set expectations correctly and do it as early as possible, because those outcomes, the art of the possible, it does differ a lot by organisation, by size, by industry, geography, level of digital maturity, and so on.
So Claire, you mentioned that idea of the political aspect of it, and there's some conversation going back and forth in the comments of that as well. And for anybody that isn't joining in, make sure you're making your way there. There's like, as is our typical from the audience, we've got paragraphs that I don't think I could put on the screen and give people the opportunity to interact with this way. Kieran, I'm going to come to you for our next question. And for someone who is always up for a new idea and experimenting with things, I kind of love that I get to ask you this question. But is there a time and a place that maybe we should be saying no as a way to avoid potential failure?
Brilliant question, Emma. And the answer is yes, or maybe not no, but not yet is maybe the better way of phrasing it. So I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said to date, but you've heard a lot. If the culture's not ready for it, then, don't begin. You're just going to spend a lot of money, waste a lot of time. If your technology isn't up to it, and by that I mean you have a lot of redundant, aging tech, RPA, IA, or whatever else, putting a layer or a smattering of that on top is never going to solve your problems. If the people aren't ready for it, and again, be careful here, because this isn't a technology or whatever other problem. You need to educate your people as to what digital transformation means. Paint a bright and shiny picture to the future. An executive has to own this. They have to do it. Every executive has to do this. You have to bring people with you, get people ready for transformation, because I hear a lot of times businesses blaming people, they're not ready and they're resisting. But actually, what does the future look like? You haven't told me. You haven't told me that I'm good enough, but all these people coming into the organization are brilliant and I'm not. What about my training? What about the people inside of the business themselves, the citizen developers, the citizen innovators who can and should be involved in the project from beginning, middle, and end? Have you actually gone about that? Have you got that sponsor? Have you got that tooling? Are your processes ready? And remember this, that sometimes technology is not the answer. There are things in marketing called key moments of truth. In other words, if you take the example of a doctor telling a patient they've got cancer, if you've got the example of someone's in the middle of a car crash or in the middle of a claim where they've been badly injured, the last thing you want under God's earth is a robot or a chatbot giving you the outcome. So again, technology is not always the answer. Businesses need to get themselves ready for digital transformation, which is a bit of an oxymoron, because sometimes there's just no time like the present and you have to start. Otherwise, that phrase I use on this show very often, digital Darwinism, kicks in. In other words, if you don't digitally transform, you're in trouble. So there's lots of things you need to do to get ready. I think one of the biggest things as well is recognize you will make mistakes, recognize things will go wrong. It is tough to admit those, but be big enough and brave enough to do it. Reflect on everything that you're doing and go and go and go and go again, and take the learning that you got and keep pivoting on it. So maybe not no entirely, apart from maybe certain organizations, but at this stage, because we're all organizations in the world are turning into technology businesses, more Emma and not yet, but get the bases ready and then start to load the bases with everything we've talked about to date.
Wonderful. And I do want to make one point. I'm not saying I don't like the paragraphs. I'm just saying I can't put them on the screen. Keep it going. I love seeing the conversation go because we can only have 2 people on with us at a time in our roundabout here. So I love to see the conversations continuing. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to have to kind of cut down on some of the answers length time frame here. But James, I'm going to come to you with this question first, and then come to you, Claire, to round us out for our time today. But we've made the promise that we're going to talk to people about how do we help get the program back on track, and what are the things that we do to rescue a program gone wrong. So James, I'm going to come to you for a couple of pointers on how to get things back on track.
Yeah, thank you. I think to wrap it up slightly, one of the keys is understand where you are in your program. You know, are you beginning, middle, end? What are you trying to achieve? I mentioned all of that earlier, but that really critically will help you scale. And help you actually remedy. If you're, let's say, at a tactical stage, so you're just trying to build momentum and your program starts failing, then maybe you need to look at why your automation's failing, right? A more simpler thing of, do you have an environment that's fit for purpose for these automations? Have you thought about how you're going to support them, right? If an automation fails, what does that mean for your program going forward? So for us, from a tactical level, your solutions might be a little bit more straightforward, but nonetheless, require the same amount of investment to actually solve. And look at it from more of a strategic level. So the example I mentioned earlier, where you're trying to scale it across the organization, can you potentially reprioritize the automations you're focusing on? Can you find one of higher value to kind of reignite a failed automation campaign? Because we've seen it before where if you fail once, you can probably get back on track, but fail more than that, and it's going to be really hard to knock down those doors. The bit I'll sort of add at the end here is use data you have. It's really key to learn and understand from where you failed, and it's really key to build on that to move it forward. So don't ignore that data you gathered, because it's going to be really essential for everyone to kind of build the program and move it forward. And if you do have to pivot, if you do have to change direction, don't be afraid to. Just make sure you've got the right people alongside you to do it.
Wonderful. So then, Claire, I'm going to come to you to wrap our session for the day.
Yeah, and I really will try and wrap this. This is one of those subjects I could happily talk about all day, but I will try and distill your absolute must-haves for your remediation program into the real core ingredients. And I'd say it's a 4-point list, right? You need to make sure you've got your compelling need, committed sponsors, measurable opportunity, reasonable expectations of outcome. Make sure you understand the pitfalls I mentioned earlier and ensure that you're armed against them. It sounds like a very repetitive message, but sponsorship. You can't be an effective sponsor from a distance. Really important to broadcast successes as well. That in turn creates that momentum, that engagement, and starts to create more champions throughout the business and even beyond if you're feeling particularly ambitious.
I'm really struggling on the draw of getting myself off of mute today, everybody. Karen
really? Didn't happen. So I was happy. Running the show. Didn't happen.
So I do see in some of the comments that we're getting the feedback that we need to make sure that we have an hour-long episode coming up. And I'm going to take just a moment before we wrap up to make a plug that next month we will, in fact, have an hour-long episode. Karen and I have been at the Third Thursday game now for just about a year. So come December, it's our 1-year anniversary. And so we're bringing back some previous guests. We've got Pascal Bornet joining us for the first time. And we're going to do something a little different. And we're going to be kind of round robining people in for a game of the Wheel of Intelligent Automation. So I promise.
And special guest.
Yes, and a special holiday-themed guest. But we will have a physical wheel that will be spinning, and no one will know what question they're going to land on and what they're going to have to answer. So it's going to be a fun little game for us to celebrate 1 year and bring forward some really great folks in the space of automation. Before we leave today, I want to sincerely thank Claire and James for joining us for the conversation and adding so much value to this idea of rescuing a transformation. I think we talk a lot about what to do to be successful on the front, but it's really great to focus on maybe how to help people that have already found themselves in a hole. So thank you both so much for joining us today, and everybody in the chat and joining us live on the stream, or anybody that's maybe watching this later. But happy Third Thursday, everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.